and welcome to this short webinar on self-harm. My name is Sally Openshaw and I'm a psychotherapist and counsellor who spent many years being alongside people who have found self-harm to be useful. Today I'm going to introduce you to my colleague Lisa, who's here with me.
Hi, I'm Lisa. I work at Somerset Counselling Centre in Taunton. I trained in integrative therapy and I have been working as a therapist now for nearly 2 years.
Okay, so we're going to start by outlining what we're planning to do in this session so you have a sense of the shape. So we have 4 main objectives for you. The first, what I want us to look at together are the myths and truths behind self-harm. We're going to explore the meaning of self-harm. Then we're going to look at different ways we can support somebody who has the urge to self-harm. And then we're going to talk about resources and all the other useful things that might help you if you're alongside someone who's self-harming who really needs your support. So self-harm is about hurting yourself. It's about hurting your body tissue. And what's really important is the intention behind it. And mainly, people harm when they have really difficult, painful memories or overwhelming situations. People who self-harm tend to believe that no one will be able to soothe their pain. The only person that they can rely on to soothe them is themselves. So when we were preparing this, Lisa and I talked together about all of the ways we thought people might self-harm. But before we tell you our ideas, I just thought, just take a moment and think of all the ways you already know of how people harm themselves. So let's have a look at your list compared to the list that Lisa and I are now going to just prepare for you verbally. So Lisa, let's just spark some ideas between us. What sort of ways come to your mind when I talk about self-harm?
Okay, well, when I think of self-harm, I'm probably thinking of some of the clients that come into the therapy room. So I have experience of working with clients that pick their skin. That's a form of self-harm. Picking in general, burning the skin, piercing, finding ways to pierce and cut the skin, and another one is the use of using food as a way of harming the body.
Yeah, there's some great ones in there. So thanks. I'd add to that things like picking scabs and interfering with healing. If you've been stitched, undoing stitches before the wound is healed adequately. Certainly other substances as well as food that you might excessively use that might cause harm to your body or to yourself. I can't remember if you said scraping. So compasses are often used in school, sharp objects, cutting particularly with things like razor blades or broken glass that gets picked up that may not even be clean. So that covers the main areas of the sort of things that you would see where someone will injure themselves. I'm sure you might have got other things on your list, and some of the things are quite questionable. It's like if we look at some of the acceptable self-harm, we might consider tattooing, self-beautification rather than self-harm, or having your ears pierced. And technically they might fit under the definition, but we may not want to interpret them as an actual self-injury or self-harm activity. Okay, so moving on from there, what I want us to look at together are the myths and truths behind self-harm. And the reason why we thought this was important is there's a lot of misinformation about self-harm. So we wanted to correct that misinformation by going through a list of myths. So the first myth is that people who actually, no, before I tell you the answer to the myths, just look down through the list yourself and put a true or false alongside each of the statements that are there. Do it spontaneously, not without much thought. If you're a teacher running this session, this might be something that you would get the whole group to do, and then you might facilitate much more discussion between you all on each of the aspects. So I'll just give you a moment to put your own thoughts down on paper. So let's start with the first myth. People who self-harm do not feel pain. This is a myth, and it's really important to correct this myth because it can be incredibly painful to have the first injury that may be self-inflicted, but even more painful if people believe it doesn't hurt. So most of the people who harm themselves feel the pain when they damage themselves. Even if they are numbed out before, the pain will hit them on the injury. And that pain will persist well beyond the injury. So in the healing process, the pain will also persist. So scars may become very itchy, may become uncomfortable. If they harm again, then the scar is going to cause more pain. So it hurts. And it's not because they like pain that they're doing it, which is another myth. But the hurt in itself may be really important function of the harm, which I'll explain a little bit more in a minute. So the second myth, people who self-harm are just trying to get attention. And this is a really important one to address as well, because the attitude that's in that statement is that we should ignore people that self-harm. And actually, that's the opposite of what we want you to consider doing. Of course, someone who shows you their self-harm is asking for your attention, but the majority of people who self-harm will do it in private, without anyone knowing, will go to great extremes to cover it over. And if you do notice it and challenge them on it, will probably feel very ashamed and will not necessarily want to talk to you about it. So there's a very delicate balance to be had here. So occasionally, Lisa and I talked earlier, there are people who share their self-harm on social media, and they do it as a sort of a glory show. And that still needs attention, but it's not typical of the usual self-harm pattern, which is hidden. So the next question is, people who self-harm are trying to kill themselves. This is also a myth. People who self-harm are doing the absolute opposite. People who self-harm are trying to keep alive whilst also managing difficult emotions that are overwhelming. So it is true that some people do kill themselves when they're self-harming, but normally people who cut or injure themselves do it with great precision. The times when they're likely to get it wrong is if they do it during an episode when they've also consumed large amounts of alcohol or when they're drug taking as well, because then their judgment is slightly less able as when they're doing it in a normal state. So, no, they are not wanting to kill themselves. It's a survival strategy. They are doing their best to stay alive.
I think it's also worth noting, Sally, at that point, that people also like to feel something when they feel very challenged by feelings, that actually the process of self-harm creates a sense of being able to cope with the numbness that they feel with feelings, that actually cutting, hurting, creates something happens, something is happening, that they can actually feel something.
Yeah. No, thank you, Lisa. That's a good addition. Of course, the purpose of cutting brings some feeling back when often they can be quite numbed out, and dissociated is the term that we would use for that numbing out. So thanks for that clarity. So the next statement is people who self-harm are mentally ill. This is generally not the case. There are some types of mental illness where there is psychosis, where self-harm may be a feature of that mental illness. And sometimes in depression, self-harm may be a feature. But the sort of self-harm you see in psychosis is much more exaggerated and usually much more extreme. It's also episodal. It happens only when their mood state is really altered. So generally, people who self-harm are not mentally ill. They're like you and me. They are people who are really trying to help manage a difficult set of circumstances.
And Sally, would you say that part of that also is quite ritualistic? That those clients that might be suffering with more psychotic episodes that do it less frequently, are more one-off kind of episodes, whereas somebody that was involved in self-harm was more ritualistic. Would you say that?
Yes, so I'm going to come to that in the next one when we talk about how they plan it. So you're absolutely right. The only group that may have a mental health diagnosis is if someone had a post-traumatic response, which self-harm was part of. So if it was a sign of post-traumatic stress disorder, then self-harm may come under one of the symptoms of a mental health diagnosis. So that one's kind of true and false, depending on the nature of the self-harm and the circumstances of the story for that person. So the next one you've already led us into beautifully, Lisa, which is people who self-harm don't plan to do it. And that is a myth. Most people who self-harm are incredibly ritualistic about it. They have a place where they keep things. They often lay things out in a certain way before cutting or burning. It's much less likely to be impulsive. It's often they make great attempts not to do it first. And so, yes, there's usually ritual, there's a plan, and that plan would get followed through in a certain way. So there is preparation for people who harm. And you're right, I think a more psychotic, chaotic self-harm would be less ritualistic, be much more impulsive, and slightly different in the way it gets thought about in advance. So the next question is more women than men self-harm, and that is true. And there is a greater proportion of women that self-harm. And there's a belief that this may well be because men feel even more shame than women might do about it. And so it's an underreported male issue. So as teachers and as colleagues, I want us to don't think of this as just affecting women, even though the statistics show there's a greater numbers within women. The typical age starting self-harm, it's absolutely true. The typical age is from 14 onwards. It has been shown to be much earlier in children who have a history of childhood sexual abuse and the trauma that goes with that. But the general, you're looking at teenagers as a starting point, but self-harm can continue way on into later life for many people. And then the last point is 1 in 8 people self-harm, and that's true. It is a much higher statistic than probably you might expect, and that's partly because of the hidden nature of self-harm. So that's a quick walk through the truths and the myths. And if you would like to learn more about the truths and the myths, then we would recommend Life Signs as a really good resource for you to go and look at. It's full of people's own stories about their self-harming behaviour and their activities. So it's a really useful resource that's very human and very personable. So I recommend that to you.
It's very accessible, I would say. It's one of the sites that I personally, it's given me lots of information, and it crosses so many different areas. It's very useful.
Okay, so over to you. Look at the meaning behind self-harm.
Okay, so the meaning behind self-harm can be very complicated, and it varies from one individual to another. So with that in mind, I have got a nesting doll here to explore the self. I'll pop it there, that's probably easy for you to see. And the nesting doll obviously has an interior and it has an exterior world. And it's very good for exploring what's going on for an individual. So I use it quite a lot in therapy. Teachers might want to use the idea of the nesting doll to explore perhaps with a student what's going on, because quite often I think a lot of clients and a lot of um, pupils that might self-harm find it very hard to explain what it is, how they feel. So that might be very internal, what's going on inside, but it also might be things that are happening externally around their world, what's going on with their families or their social situations, school, work, pressures of all things that exist outside of themselves. So this nesting doll, if we open her up, she has got some feelings inside her that she can only really explore with words, just odd words. So she's hopeless. She feels hopeless. She feels unloved. She feels lonely. She feels some shame, and she feels judged. Now that will obviously vary for different individual, but this is what this one brings today. And just by looking at what's going inside, what she's feeling inside is a way of exploring that world. So what are her self-beliefs? What might she think about herself? What are her judgments? What does she carry inside compared to how she shows the world on the outside? Do they match? Do they correlate? Does her physical appearance and her personality or attitude change? And what does self-harm provide for her? Is it a distraction? Is it allowing the kind of inside feelings of what we talked about, shame, judgment, and so on, to be able to be let out, find a way to come out? And that is what sometimes self-harm is doing. It's providing almost an outlet for those kind of suppressed emotions that feel often very hard to explain and explore verbally. Part of understanding the client's world is also understanding what is going on, externally. So there could very well be family pressures. There could very well be, huge expectations on the self in terms of, academic achievements. There might be breakups at home and early trauma that hasn't found it a way out of the body internally. And really, I think that the nesting doll is quite a nice way of exploring what is hidden and what is seen. And at school or college, you could use these in paper form as well, and you can buy these nesting dolls as plain. They don't have anything on, so you can paint them, colour code them, and so on. They're a really useful way of just seeing what's going on, just having a little look, a little peek into the individual's world.
So one of the things that we've identified on this slide, and Lisa also made reference to it, is that the meaning behind the harm is going to vary from individual to individual. And we call that autobiographical. It's like their story is going to be different, and everybody will have a story that is different. And so if you're wanting to be alongside somebody who's harming, there is to understand that it's not going to be the same for everyone, that each person will have a unique history that will influence their behavior, even if they use the same strategy for harming as someone else. Certainly, if you read what people say, they talk about getting rid of the horridness they feel inside themselves. And as they cut, or as they see the blood flowing, if they're harming using an object, that actually that flow of blood is life affirming. It's about, I'm still alive, my body is still bleeding. There can be lots of ceremony about how they manage the blood, so they can lick it, they can mop it, they can manage it in very different ways. The sight of the blood can often shock them into coming back into contact with the environment they're in. So if they really have disappeared into their internal world, which may be carrying all those sorts of things that Lisa just talked about, it brings them back out into the external world, onto their external body boundary by the injury and being alongside the impact that that has. So it can be very useful for someone who's stuck inside themselves, stuck listening to negative self-talk or negative thoughts about themselves or overwhelming feelings. Somehow it has the capacity to reground them in the here and now. The other thing is that some people talk about the damage coming out. They damage their outside self rather than feeling the damage on their inside self. So that boundary that Lisa was talking about is important. What's happening inside, and by cutting or harming or scratching, you bring it out of the inside onto your outside. It definitely provides some relief. And that's not just because of the chemistry of what happens, because it will cause an endorphin reaction. So that will change people's pain response in that moment. Although it will still be painful, the actual hurting, it will have some relief, particularly if there's a huge amount of pent up emotion. It sort of contains the overwhelm and brings it into a slightly different focus.
I think, Sam, it's also worth noting that some people's relationship with self-harm continues for many, many years, and that it's a private relationship that quite often some people don't want to stop because, like you just said, it's their mechanism, it's their way of managing that. And so whether you're picking, whether you're cutting, or whatever you're doing, it's almost like your special relationship with it. And for others to look on that and say, stop or stop it or just cease doing it. It's not as easy as that. It can go on for many years.
Yeah, you're right. I remember working with someone who had many scars on her arm. And when I asked her about her scars, she told me each one had a memory of a story. And she could tell me the story of her life through the map of the scars that she'd created on her body. And she didn't want to lose those stories or cover them with makeup or cover them with long sleeves because they were part of who she was at various times in her life. Okay, so moving into the next bit, we want us to think jointly about what can you do instead of self-harming? And this is not us saying, stop it, you need to stop hurting yourself. It's trying to help a client to think of alternative things they can do to help express their distress in that moment, rather than breaking their skin and potentially causing any injury. And so the next slide, things to do if you feel like hurting yourself, is a useful one to look at. So the first thing that we encourage people to do is to make contact with someone who's going to listen to the pain behind the wish to harm. And this may not be anyone who's close to you, because the people very close to you may not be able to stand listening to the pain. It'd be too distressing for them. And so we would encourage someone who's harming to think of all of the services where you can ring and make contact with someone who's willing to listen to you and someone who will respond to you in that place, so you don't feel lonely and isolated. If you remember, I said earlier, people who self-harm believe no one will be able to soothe them. So it's beginning to challenge that belief, which is you don't have to do this on your own. Other people can be with you when you do it, and other people can be alongside you when you talk about the urge to do it. Sometimes people are encouraged to draw on their own hand and to get something that represents the cut they would make, and to actually draw it. If that cut was able to speak, what would that cut be saying now? If I wanted to cut again, that kind of needing to put some force into it so that it actually is a representation on my skin rather than an actual damage to my skin. You can also pick up an ice cube, and you can do exactly the same with an ice cube. You can hold it on the area. So you'll get a painful response, but you're not actually going to damage your skin. And some of the techniques I was taught when I was working in mental health was the use of elastic bands or hair bands, where you can actually pick up bits of skin and quite tightly use an elastic band, which you can ping to give you a pain response, but without actually causing any damage. Trying to express your feelings in different ways is another strategy. And so punching things that aren't going to hurt your hands, like a pillow cushion, ripping up magazines, particularly thick magazines, because it requires quite a lot of effort for you to be able to do it. Shouting, releasing, even if you haven't got good words, going out and shouting at a tree or something that's not going to be frightened by hearing you shout or embarrass you in any way. So finding a place where you can express the emotion that's caught up inside. One of the things that can work at this time of the year is trying to smash a coconut so that you're using your upper body strength, and you can throw it against a wall and try and do that damage of smashing it, because it won't smash very easily. And so you can have repetitively, this is what I'd like to say about, or give yourself that expression as you're throwing the coconut against something solid. Jumping on balloons and bursting them, that can be a good way of hearing the expression and the noise. Bubble wrap sometimes works. If it's big bubble wrap, that works. You can get quite a lot of release through the jumping and letting it out of your body, but also the sound that you're going to create. If you need a more gentle alternative, then a relaxing bath or shower, focusing on the flow of the water so you don't let your thoughts keep going back to the negative self-talk. So something that focuses on the sensation on your body in a positive and different way. Listening to music can help people, and if it's not enough just listening to the music, trying to learn the lyrics. That will include you using a different bit of your brain, and so it will bring you out of that repetitive self-talk that may not be so useful. So learning anything, bit of poetry, reading a page of book and trying to recite it again, that will challenge your body to think in a different way. A lot of the material talks about finding a safe place. The difficulty is we have to accept that some people have never had a safe place in their life. And so it has to be a safe enough place, or a moment of safety, rather than us thinking of it of a safe place they could go to. And this can often be an imagined place. You can have people in it that you would want to have around you, that are people who feel like they'd be on your side, people in your team. That could be fantasy figures, or it could be your dog in your imagination. But create a safer place where you can allow your emotions to reduce. And once you've had some time in your safe place, you can come back into being in contact with other people.
And that safe place also might be something like a box that you create. I don't know if you're going to move on to that, Sally, but like a little box or some little almost like a little treasure chest that keeps all these things in one place, so that you can almost carry it around a bit like a toolkit, so that you do have your music in there, and that you do have your favourite little object or toy, or something that reminds you of some kind of comfort or distraction. It might be a childhood soft piece of fur or soft toy that provides a sense of relief. And in that, you might also have a piece of paper that you can doodle and draw things, and And so it's almost like a whole package that you can access when you feel like you need that type of distraction and comfort and reassurance, a little box of sort of reassurance, if you like.
That's brilliant. And that was the last thing on the slide. So thank you for covering that for me. The most important thing is you use as many of your senses as you can in designing your safety plan. And your safety has to really match the sort of force of the self-harm. So if your self-harm is a quiet, reflective thing, you probably want your safety to be quiet and reflective. If your self-harm is quite aggressive or violent, you might need something that's much more physical as part of your package. So how to support someone who's self-harming? So as teachers, parents, or if you've got peers who are self-harming, the most important thing you can do is be with that person in a non-judging way. That the best you can do is understand that they are in pain when they're doing that, and that they are trying to keep themselves alive, like I've suggested earlier. So the first practical thing to do is to show concern for the injury. So you may need resources available for them so that they can cover up their injury in a way that would prevent infection and can be really responsive to any damage that they may do. And that would include being loving and supportive to provide them with steri strips if need be, or good bandaging so that they can protect further infection. If you don't feel able to listen because you're too close or you're too overwhelmed, then remind them that there are listening services available. I think the other important thing is to really convey support for their efforts to survive and appreciation that even though they're hurting themselves, you know that they're doing their best to survive and keep going with overwhelming emotions. Encouraging them to think about those buried feelings and if they would like some support to speak to someone else. So, potential referral to a counselling team within the college or referral to any of the agencies outside that might be able to support. And on the resources for all of these sessions, you will have a list of really useful resources like Mind, like the National Self Harm Injury Network. There are some really important resources there that we would encourage you to encourage them to think about. And there are two apps that are available on their phone, so they can be with them at all times, so they could rely on them. So the first resource we would recommend, the first app is called Calm Harm, and that is a downloadable free app available on their phone, which will talk them through things to do when they need to calm themselves when they're thinking of self-harming. The second one is an NHS-based one, and it's called Distract with the ACT, the ACT in capital letters. That's another app for self-harm that they can have available, and I would encourage people to try both and see which one works the best for them. Alongside the apps, I've already mentioned listening services, and then there are some really specific support groups that might be useful for people. And so if you type in self-injury or self-harm into Google, you will get a list of all the resources that are available. We've already signposted Life Signs because we think that's the one that is the most comprehensive, useful resource for people who are wanting to find out more about self-harm. So it's the one we like the best. So as we finish this webinar, we'd like to leave you with a take-home message. And that take-home message is that self-harm is complex. Each individual will have a different story that will influence why they do what they do, even if the behaviours may appear to be very similar. But we want you to think that self-harm does not have to be a lonely experience that happens in isolation.
Yeah, absolutely. It can be shared, it can be understood, and it can be heard by others. So you don't have to be alone with those feelings.
So thank you very much for listening to this short webinar. We hope the information has been useful for you.